So the idea is that we can start thinking about how to move the ball forward when we're thinking about the next legislative session and the issues and the policies that we've identified today that either negatively impact or could positively impact the issues that we're talking about. That being said, I know some of you in the room might have legislative experience already, and some may have far more than I do, so I apologize if this is review for some of you. But all in all, I hope it's helpful. I'm going to go through the Texas legislative process and kind of give you some idea of where your voices can be heard and how to think through policies that we can give to legislators in the next legislative session. So this is a really simplified version of how a bill becomes a law in Texas. A bill is first filed by a legislator, which can be in either house, in the House or the Senate, and then it has to go through a committee hearing phase. And this is where the public can go to the Capitol and testify or register support or opposition for a bill. After the committee hearing process, the bill will head to either the calendars or the intent calendar, House or Senate, and that committee will then set the bill for debate on the House floor. From there, the bill will be heard on the House floor, will be voted on, and then will make its way to the other House just to go through the same process and then finally be signed by the governor. Of course, this is assuming that the bill makes it into law. And really, most bills get held up right here. So as I was preparing for today, I looked at some of the bills that were filed in the last legislative session that touch upon some of the issues that were brought up in the community impact statement that y'all have in your folders. And so last session, Representative Sinfronia Thompson, pictured right here, filed House Bill 2550. And we heard from a participant in the community impact statement, Sherry, and Sherry told us that they don't have outreaches for blacks here in Austin, especially black women. I mean, if it wasn't for my daughter talking to Miss Roberts, I wouldn't know anything about Maya. You're just kind of lost in the loophole. And so I was looking for a bill that might touch upon some of the issues that are brought up here by Sherry. So Representative Thompson filed this bill that would create a task force to assess and make recommendations on family support and parent education programs. And so this bill did not pass, it did not become law, but it did get relatively far in the legislative process. So it got through the House only to die in the Senate. One thing I wanted to point out is every time a bill is heard in a committee hearing, the Legislative Budget Board creates this document called the Fiscal Impact Statement. And basically this statement tells legislators how much the bill is going to cost, either the state or local jurisdictions. So that becomes a really important document as you're trying to convince legislators why this bill should get through. So you can say it's not going to cost very much. Or if it is going to cost a lot, here's where you can look at costs that would be offset through the work that's going to be done with this new law. So this bill, which got relatively far in the process, the Legislative Budget Board found that there was no significant fiscal implication to the state that was anticipated. So the next bill from last session that I'm highlighting, I chose from looking at this statement by Jamie. And Jamie said, I believe we can afford to put our kid in a very good situation. But still, how do you know that the treatment will be at the level that you desire? Do they stimulate your baby by playing with your baby every few hours? Or is your baby just in this bed getting diaper rash because they haven't been changed in a few hours? And so Jamie's statement speaks to kind of two levels in childcare. One level is the issue of adequate care being provided to children and babies who are in daycare. But the other level is the stress that family and mothers feel when they're worrying about whether their children are getting adequate care. And so I chose this bill by Representative Sarah Davis, HB 2903, and this one would have increased initial training hours for daycare workers and focus annual training to core areas of development like teacher-child interaction. And this bill passed the House and died in the Senate. I also want to say that I'm highlighting these bills not because I endorse them or think they're necessarily the right solution, but I do think they're kind of like working towards solutions to issues that have been brought up through the community impact statement and that we've heard about today. And again, this, oh yes, ma'am.
Where can we find out the reasons for the bill was killed? Is that documented anywhere?
that's such a good question, and it kind of points to some of the frustration that I've had with the system. I was able to work in there, so being in the committee, I could kind of tell why bills weren't going through. You know, whether there was someone who was local, who was talking to the legislator and saying it's going to cost these people a lot of money and they're going to be really angry about it, or whether it was statewide unions that were getting together in opposition of it because they might have to, you know, worry about new certifications or that kind of thing. That points to a very opaque part of our system, really. The one thing is if a bill gets a committee hearing, you can look, if it gets a hearing, and I believe it has to get onto the calendar, but you can look up a witness list in a lot of cases, and that, I think, can be really helpful. Not every bill has a witness list, so it's only if that one was able to get far enough in the process, such that that document's been produced. But it gives you an idea of who was for the bill and who was against it. And that's kind of, you know, who killed the bill. So it's a bit of detective work, and you can't always get to the bottom of it.
Can you also listen to the archive here?
Yes, you can.
Do that as well.
Thank you for pointing that out. The committee hearings are archived online. Some can be really long, but not that many are. And you can also find the meeting minutes. So it'll give you a list of the bills in the order in which they were heard. So if you're going through like a 4 or 5 hour committee hearing, you can kind of get an idea of where the bill you're looking for was heard in that meeting. And I think also the floor debate is transcribed. So I think you should be able to get records if it does make it to the floor. But again, as I pointed out, most bills don't even get past that committee process. Thank you for your questions. So this bill, HB 2903, like I said, it's really the right path to addressing some of the issues, but this is a path a legislator thought of last session to deal with quality child care issues. And this bill also went relatively far in the legislative process, so it got through the House, but it died in the Senate. And again, the fiscal impact statement for this bill stated that no significant fiscal implication to the state was anticipated. So the third bill I wanted to highlight also deals with the issue of quality child care, and specifically affordability of child care. So this one was introduced by Representative Jessica Farrar. HB 1521 would have given state agencies the authority to establish child care subsidy programs to assist their low-income employees with child care costs. This one was left pending in the committee after the committee hearing. So it got cut off at that kind of stage that I pointed out earlier where you lose most of the bills at the committee level. So it didn't make it into the other house. And I also want to point out what the fiscal note said about this bill. The fiscal implications of the bill cannot be determined at this time, but it could be significant. This really becomes important, not necessarily when you're dealing with your allies who are on board and understand why we need this legislation. It becomes really important when you're dealing with people who don't fundamentally understand the importance of what we're talking about. Yes?
So, what happens when at the end of the session, there's nothing in this session? It has to start over. And the ones that died have to start over, have to go over the process.
Yes. The one thing I'll say is sometimes you can build momentum throughout sessions. So I saw some bills last session that got pretty far or got passed in the prior session, had passed through the House. Or I saw bills that you saw introduced for 10 years before they became law. So it is a very gradual process, and you are basically brought back to the beginning. But at that point, a lot of the legislators kind of have an idea of what you're doing, or should have an idea of what you're doing. So one thing that these three bills that I've mentioned all have in common is that they were filed by members of the Texas Women's Health Caucus. And here's a list of the members. We'll make this available online. It's a pretty good number, and these are people who are committed to laws that benefit women's health. Representative Farrar, who filed one of the bills I just mentioned, is the chair, and Representative Don Howard here in Austin is the vice chair of that committee. Another caucus that you should be able to count on for allies in these issues is the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. And here are the members of that caucus. The chair position is currently open since Sylvester Turner is now mayor of Houston, but the vice chair is Nicole Collier, and I'm told that they probably will be electing someone in the beginning of next session for the chair position. So really reaching out to members individually is probably the best way to go about contacting either of these caucuses. But of course, we're not just talking about allies in the Texas legislature. The Texas legislature does not bear a strong resemblance to the people in this room. It is mostly white men. And to get 50% of votes and 50% of people on board, going to have to come up with reasons of why they need to support these issues. A lot of them probably don't know that this is a problem. So I think informing and communicating is a really wonderful place to start. So one thing I noticed when I was looking at bills from last session was a lot of them kind of dealt with the issues that were brought up in the community impact statement, but more kind of on the periphery, and I didn't think many of them really struck to the heart of what women were finding were challenges to accessing care, whether prenatal care or child care. And so I kind of went through and tried to identify some of the problems in the community impact statement thematically that women are having, and then just kind of throw out some policy ideas. And these look a lot like the policy ideas that you'll see in the members brief that's also in your folder. So women spoke of a lack of community support and resources. One idea is you could fund community centers and programs focused on Black women's needs. Asked to set up a grant program that would have its own budget line and have its own bill, and then from there, local organizations, if that were to pass, would be able to apply for grant funding to help support the programs that we're talking about today. Women also spoke of lack of access to resources, so not just lack of resources, but problems with access. So what if we required agencies that provide resources to develop community outreach plans? Women also spoke about alienation and discrimination in healthcare facilities and by healthcare workers. So how about we require cultural competency or undoing racism training for certain certifications for healthcare workers or for healthcare facilities even? Or funding community liaisons, which I know is something we've talked about this morning, to help bridge community and healthcare providers. Women also spoke about physical stress during pregnancy due to lack of employer accommodations. So we could require employers to devise pregnant employee accommodation plans to reduce physical stress and then the stressors that come from that stress. And finally, lack of choice with respect to daycare. So a couple of the bills we saw kind of assumed that women would be using daycare providers. But what if women had a choice about when they could return to work? What if they're not ready to leave their babies 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 10 weeks, however many weeks? What if they can't afford to not go back to work in that time? So we could start by providing paid family leave to state employees, or require that employers offer flex and part-time options to new parents. So I also want to talk about ways that you can use your voice during the legislative session and leading up to the legislative session. The first thing is meet with legislators. Call and ask for a meeting. In my experience, most of them will take it, especially if you're a constituent. If you say, hey, I'm in your district, I'm really concerned about this issue, could you meet with me? Worst case scenario, they'll probably just give you a staffer to meet with. But in any case, we have some pretty compelling literature in our hands this morning, and I think legislators would benefit from it being passed on to them. Ask them to file particular bills that target these policies. I know Leonie is going to be forming a working group coming out of its conference, and hopefully part of that working group will be identifying specific bill ideas or bill languages that can be handed to legislators. But not every legislator is going to file every bill that you ask them to file. So if they can't, for whatever reason, their plate might just be too full, ask them to support the bill. Ask, can I rely on you to support this bill when it comes up in your committee or when it comes up on the floor? And also tell them about the challenges that are facing Black women in their communities. Like I said, a lot of the men in the legislature probably don't know about these challenges. Come on with information. The folders that y'all have today, the community impact statement, the members brief, and I'm sure with all the knowledge that we have in this room, there's many more resources out there to bring to legislators and help inform them better on this topic. You can attend committee hearings in the Capitol. This is the opportunity for you to testify publicly It becomes part of the public record. You don't have to testify. You can also register your support for and against a bill, which is also reflected in the public record. So when you go to those witness lists that I mentioned, you'll see lists of names. And really, that's quite a sight when you see 50, 100, however many names, of people who are supporting or opposing certain bills. A lot of people can't make it to the Capitol. Organize email and phone call campaigns during the legislative sessions. Staying informed during the session is really important because things happen really quickly. It's kind of a mad rush to try to get things through once January 17th, I believe it is, comes along, or January 10th. So this is the Texas Legislature online website. Here you can register for bill alerts if you're following a particular bill. You can get emails when a committee hearing has been set or when the bill has made any progress through the process. You can also find out about committee hearings. So you can also register you can set up a bill alert so that you get notified when a particular committee is meeting. So like if public health is a committee that you want to keep tabs on, you'll get a notification when they post an agenda, and the bills that they'll be hearing will be on that agenda. You can also do bill searches. This is a great tool by subject matter. So if child care is something you're interested in, that's one of the subject area topics. You can put that in, and all the bills that deal with child care will be listed there for you. And finally, legislator contact info, so you can bug your legislators. These are some important dates to keep in mind as we're thinking about the next legislative session. November 14th, 2016, which is right around the corner, is when pre-filing begins. So that's when bills can start to be filed. January 10th, 2017 is the first day of the legislative session. That's when the madness begins. March 10th, 2017 is the deadline for bills to be filed. You want to get your bills to your legislators well before this deadline. And May 29th, 2017 is the last day of the legislative session. That kind of gives you an idea of how little time we have to try to get good bills passed. And then just some final pointers heading into this thought process. Know your allies, the people in this room, the lobbying groups that have aligned interests, whether in this room or outside of this room, the Texas Women's Health Caucus, which I mentioned earlier, and the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. Also build coalitions. We have to go beyond our natural or obvious allies. Reach beyond core values to find less traditional allies. I thought it was really interesting that you talked about going to the pregnancy crisis centers, because sometimes when you're thinking about choice in women's health, that's not necessarily what comes to mind, but if you're looking for how to bring resources to pregnant women, that's where you can find them. So I thought that was kind of an example of thinking beyond your more traditional allies. Staying informed, track your legislation, show up if you can, call if you can, and on that note, NAD.